Hello and welcome to episode 38 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we're going to be taking a look at field of view and camera options. Now all of this can be found over in the options section of the main menu under the camera tab, and then we've got the field of view tab up here and also a movement tab with a lot of the helmet options and a couple of other additional kind of camera shake, world movement and GForce effects there. But we'll start off taking a look at field of view, which is essentially how much picture you can see within the confines of your screen. With a wider or a higher field of view, you'll be able to see much more. You'll have a wider picture and you'll be able to see more around the peripheral vision, kind of almost like a bit like a fisheye effect. You have a heightened sense of speed, but it'll be much more difficult to judge braking distances or just distances in general. But with a lower field of view, you'll lose a lot of that peripheral vision and your focus will be a lot more as to what you can see directly in front of you, but your judgment of distances will be quite a bit more accurate and easier to judge and be able to make apexes and get close to cars and nail braking points and things like that. So it kind of, people go two different ways with it. Some people like to go for what should be their proper calculated field of view, and other people up their field of view to get a greater sense of speed. But with that, obviously, like I said, it becomes more difficult to judge distances, so it's harder to nail your braking points, it's harder to clip the apexes perfectly and judge how much distance there is between you and the car in front of you or alongside you. And obviously with that comes a bit more inconsistency. Generally people who run much lower or more narrower field of views generally tend to be quicker, they're more consistent, they're more accurate. So it's kind of, it isn't necessarily the lower the better, because there is a bit of science and a bit of math behind it. Fortunately there's great websites out there such as projectimmersion.com, where they have a field of view calculator, where essentially what you do is if you go onto the site, you pick the game that you're using, in this case Project Cars, you choose how many monitors that you're using, whether you're using a single screen setup or whether you're using a triple screen setup, and then you choose whether you want to do the distance measuring in inches or centimeters. And essentially you input with the horizontal slider how big your screen or monitor is, and then with the human head that's there, you can move it backwards and forwards to basically the distance that your eyes are from the screen that you're using. And then with that, it will calculate your field of view that you should mathematically be using. And then with that, it will give you basically what you would see in the real world if you were to place your monitor or TV screen on the dashboard of the camera and was to basically put up like black paper or something, basically mask off the area around it. So with that you'll get basically what you would see looking through your monitor from the distance that you are sat away from it if you were to be driving the car in real life. So with that, obviously your brain is having to do less adjustment in terms of judging distances and things, which makes it a lot easier for you to be more consistent and therefore be able to judge those distances correctly and actually be able to nail your braking points, get your apexes, and just generally be more consistent. Obviously, like I was saying earlier on in the episode, with a higher field of view, the image is going to be a lot more stretched. You're going to have a greater sense of speed, but where your brain is having to kind of adjust to this different field of view that is not used to seeing in real life, it's having to recalculate everything, and it makes it much harder to judge braking distances and things like that. When it comes to VR, by the way, all this is pretty much sorted and done with you. For the VR, it's all set up to basically be exactly how it should be, because the monitor screens are literally an inch or two away from your eyes. It's all pre-configured and everything. You don't need to worry about any of this. It's only if you're not using VR and you're kind of sat either in a sim rig or just at your PC at a desk, or alternatively with consoles as well. With consoles it's a little bit more difficult because you could potentially be sat on the other side of the room using any kind of size of TV, So using the field of view calculator there will probably bring up some interesting values. The lowest that you can go to in game is 35, and the highest that you can go up to is 120 degrees in pretty much any of the different cameras that you can use and drive and race with. However, obviously using a field of view calculator, for instance, for example myself, I sit about 70 to 80 centimeters away from my monitor screen, and using the field of view calculator, I'm using a 24-inch monitor, it comes up with a value of around 40 to 42 field of view value. With that, for me, it's a little bit too low, so there is an element of comfort, but you don't really want to try and differ away or move away from it too much. I have my own personal reasons why I use my helmet camera up at a field of view of 65, kind of a little bit of it's slightly under what the default field of view for that camera actually is, but also there's other reasons, which some of them are to do with you guys. Obviously having a very narrow field of view in videos isn't too great for you guys in terms of actually watching the driving and the perspective and stuff like that. You don't really get to see too much in the peripheral vision. Also, I'm quite comfortable running with a field of view of 65 and don't really have too much trouble in judging distances, nailing braking points, apexes, anything like that. Obviously it'll be much easier if I was to use the proper field of view that the calculator is suggesting, or using a lower value to 65. But yeah, I have my own reasons, some of them to do with you guys, obviously with the videos, and then also for myself as well. I can get headaches from running very low field of view, so that's why I tend to put it to 65. But generally with the bumper cam, the bonnet, roof, chase camera, you don't really want to fiddle with the field of view settings for those camera options. You can generally leave them as default or adjust them if you really wanted to. It only really matters with the cockpit camera and the helmet camera. Whichever of those two camera types that you actually use when driving around in game, that is what you want to be adjusting your field of view for. So projectimmersion.com is a great site for using a field of view calculator. It's got a good list of games and it's pretty easy to use and adjust. Obviously use that to see what kind of field of view setting it actually comes up with, and then input it here into the game and then drive and test it out. Obviously if you've been running with a higher field of view and it's giving you quite a low value of say between 35 to 50, it may take a little bit of time getting used to how narrow it feels, but because it's a lot more natural to what you would deal with in real life if you had your monitor there, like I was explaining, on the dashboard of the car that you were driving, your brain isn't having to adjust for the distances. So there is that. Obviously people will say that they enjoy the sense of speed and things like that, but that's also relative. For instance, driving down an open motorway at 60 miles an hour feels a lot slower than actually driving down a country road at 60 miles an hour. So with another example in game, driving around Silverstone where there's a lot of runoff area and gravel tracks and grass and the barriers are quite far away from the actual edges of the track, it's going to feel much slower driving around that circuit in comparison to say Long Beach or Azure Coast, where the environment, all the walls and everything are closed in and around you up real close, and therefore your sense of speed in that kind of environment is going to be much higher in comparison to a wide open environment. So the whole sense of speed thing kind of gets thrown out the window a little bit when it comes to field of view. Generally what you want to be doing is trying to run it as low as possible, but like I said, VR users and also console users who sit on say the sofa and you're playing with a gamepad and you've got the TV on the other side of the room, this doesn't really apply too much to you, because it'll probably come up with some wacky really low field of view setting. Ultimately just go with what you feel is comfortable and what you're happy with, but obviously try and make sure that you get it down low enough so that you're getting the consistent lap times and you're generally improving your driving and being able to judge distances a lot more easily. Now, coming down to some of the other options that are on this field of view tab, we have a field of view speed sensitivity option. Now, personally, I have this off, and generally what you should be doing if you're looking for a more realistic experience and kind of wanting to run a lower field of view is to keep this off as well. If you're looking for a slightly more cinematic experience, then you can switch this on. But basically what this will allow the game to do is it to dynamically adjust the field of view as your speed increases and decreases. It opens up these four settings here. So we've got a minimum speed sensitivity, a maximum speed sensitivity, a minimum speed sensitive speed, and a maximum speed sensitive speed. Now, your minimum speed sensitivity and maximum speed sensitivity are the minimum and maximum field of views that the game will adjust between. So I'd only really recommend putting on this field of view speed sensitivity if you're looking for a more heightened cinematic experience. It's not really it's kind of counterintuitive for actual racing with your field of view constantly and dynamically increasing and decreasing. Obviously your brain may find it quite difficult to judge distances when your field of view is constantly changing, and obviously the image is going to get warped and then unwarped, and yeah, it's not great for actual racing. But like I said, if you want that more cinematic experience, it could be worth something that you possibly want to enable. But generally I would advise leaving that set to off or set to no. So coming on to the movement tab, we have a whole series of options here. The first being a HighSpeed Shake option, which you can turn on and off. Now, if you're running a lower field of view and would like a greater sense of speed, the HighSpeed Shake is something that you can turn on to bring that element back, especially if you have just adjusted your field of view. As the speed increases, the camera will shake and vibrate a little bit, just to increase that greater sense of speed and emphasize bumps a little bit more as well. Personally, for myself, I leave this off because I find the camera shake a tiny little bit distracting, and also I like to be able to actually focus properly on whatever it is that I want to look at the time, whether it's the track, whether I'm looking for a brake marker board or a reference point, or if I want to look down into the cockpit and look at, say, the speedo or some information on my Motec display. The next option is world movement. Now, this is set at 50, which is the middle value. You can set it all the way down to 0 or set it all the way up to 100, and this is basically how much the camera moves in relation to the cockpit. With a lower world movement value, it will fix the camera to basically the horizontal plane, and you'll see the cockpit moving around independently from whatever camera it is, or the car moving around from whatever camera it is that you're using, and the camera will remain pretty much relatively still and looking pretty much directly flat at the horizon. So when you go up a hill or go down a hill, such as the hills in Bathurst, as you start to go up the hill, the camera will continue to look towards the original horizon rather than actually following the hill going up, and with that obviously the camera's going to look like it's looking down a little bit in towards the cockpit. Likewise, when going downhill, it'll remain at the horizon, and you'll be able to see a little bit more of the roof, or the roof of the car, and a lot less of the cockpit and steering wheel. And then obviously going over bumps and things like that, the camera won't really move around, but the cockpit of the car will move independently. Setting it up to a higher value will lock the camera to the cockpit movement. So with this, as you go over bumps and things like that and the car starts to bounce around, the camera will move with the cockpit as well. You'll see a lot less cockpit movement, and going up and down hills as well, the camera will go and follow the gradient of the hill, so you won't see this kind of looking down into the cockpit or looking up through the top of the cockpit as you would previously with the lower world movement value. If you suffer from motion sickness, and this is something very specific with VR as well, if you suffer with motion sickness in VR, generally what I'd advise to do is increase your world movement to a higher value, as obviously seeing all that cockpit movement without actually feeling it is what's going to cause that disconnect in your brain and kind of bring on that nausea effect with motion sickness and things like that. Whereas setting it to a higher value, your cockpit and you will be bouncing around, or shall I say, you'll see a lot less independent cockpit movement, and things will be a fair bit smoother, and yeah, it doesn't play on your brain. You don't feel quite as nauseous or quite as motion sick using the higher world movement values. Now, coming down to GForce Effect, this is essentially how much the camera is going to move around in relation to G-force. So obviously with the default value at 50, you get a moderate amount but not too much. Increasing it to a higher value will see a greater effect, and then decreasing it to a lower value will see less of an effect. And generally what this is basically, as I said, the camera moving around in relation to G-force. So the harder you accelerate, or when you stamp on the brake, or when you shift gear, the camera will jolt and move a little bit as if you're actually sat in the cockpit of the car. Obviously with the higher values, you'll see a greater effect on this, where there'll be very little to no movement when using a low G-force effect value or a value of 0. Now the next bunch of options are all to do with the helmet cam. Now here you can choose to show the helmet, whether you want it on and off, and when in the helmet cam with the show helmet option set to yes, you'll see the inside of the helmet along the top and also the bottom of your screen as well, and it also will muffle the sounds a little bit in order to kind of replicate the experience of actually wearing a helmet whilst driving as well. It's kind of a nice, neat little feature. Personally for me, I turn it off as I quite like to hear the raw sounds without it having been dampened a little bit, and also it gives me a little bit more screen space as well, because sometimes it can be a little bit distracting actually looking at the material on the inside of the helmet. And then with this, there's a whole bunch of other options as well. So there's a helmet depth of field, which as you approach and come through corners, the edges of the screen will blur a little bit more, and it'll basically just be the track in front of you at the center of the screen that will remain in focus. Personally for me, it's not something I like, because I like to be able to look down at the Motec display and be able to read the numbers and the values on there, and be able to look over at the mirrors and things whenever I need to without them being blurred. So for me personally, it's not something that I enable, but if you want a kind of a more cinematic and heightened sense of speed, the helmet depth of field option, if you're using the helmet cam, is something that you can enable, and that will give that to you. With this, you've also got a helmet look to apex, which featured in the previous project cars and also the Need for Speed Shift games as well, which is essentially as you come into the braking zone, your helmet will start to turn and look in towards the apex of the corner, and as you go through and drive through the turn as well, the helmet will also continue to look through the turn. It's quite a nice little feature and gives a little bit of kind of realistic head movement that goes on. Obviously, having a higher value will increase the amount that the helmet will look in towards the apex, and then setting it to 0 or a lower value will turn it off or decrease the amount of head movement. And then with this, you've also got a helmet leaning and also a camera leaning. Now these two are kind of fairly similar. Generally what you'll want to do is keep them as close to each other in terms of values as much as possible. But with helmet leaning, it's basically as you go through the turn and your the helmet, or shall I say the camera, is starting to look in towards the apex of the corner, the helmet will start to turn and lean in a little bit as well, as a driver head generally does when they turn through a corner at high speed and they're obviously fighting the G-force. With a higher value, obviously you'll see a lot more helmet leaning, and then with a lower value, or it's set to 0, it'll be much less movement, or it sets completely off. And obviously with that, you also have camera leaning as well, which is a little bit independent. So the helmet leaning is how much the helmet template will move when going through and turning into corners, and then the camera leaning is how much the actual camera itself will lean. Generally what you want to do, like I said, is keep these values as close to each other as possible. Otherwise you may see the helmet template moving around a little bit more than the amount that the camera is actually leaning when going through corners. As you can see, I have these all set to 0 because I use track IR when driving around. So with that, I have my own head movement is actually tracked and then inputted into the game, and just like VR, I can control where I look around the cockpit. So having these kind of the helmet look to apex and the helmet leaning and camera leaning obviously is counterintuitive to have all that stuff enabled when I myself am actually physically looking in towards the apex of the corner and controlling the head movement. So that's something to just bear in mind. Obviously when it comes to VR, I believe that all this stuff is actually turned off, but it's something that you may want to double check as well, just to make sure that you're not having that additional movement that isn't actually coming from you and is coming from the helmet look to apex kind of feature in game. The final thing that I wanted to cover for this episode was the ability to move the camera position within the cockpit or in any view that you're using. And on PC you can do this with the W, A, S and D keys, with W moving the camera position up, S moving the camera position down. You have to press the key each time to adjust the position, and then A to move the camera backwards, and D to move the camera forwards, as I am demonstrating here. Now moving the camera backwards and forwards isn't actually adjusting the field of view. The field of view is remaining the same, even though it looks like I'm adjusting the field of view. It is literally just moving the position of the camera further back inside the cockpit here, as I'm demonstrating. Likewise, if I go ahead and move it back forwards, it's not adjusting the field of view. That field of view will remain set to what it is that you have set in the game options. It is just adjusting the actual position of the camera within relative space inside the cockpit here. It is also possible to do this in the on the consoles as well. If you go into the options, controls, edit assignments, camera and view, you can bind some controller buttons to the seat forward, backwards, seat up and seat down options. You can then go in and adjust the positioning of the camera with whatever buttons you bind there. By default there isn't any buttons bound to these. One thing that I definitely recommend doing is, once you've actually found a camera position that you are happy with, unbinding those buttons that you've just bound, just to make sure that you're able to go ahead and reconfigure the controller assignments to whatever options were previously using those controls. But it is possible to move the camera position on the consoles as well. And that was just the final thing that I wanted to cover for this episode. So that is pretty much everything that I wanted to cover in this episode. Obviously, field of view is the most important part. Use that field of view calculator, work out how your field of view values should actually be set to with your own personal setup, with how you play Project Cars 2, and then obviously try it out, see what the value actually comes up with, and then input that in the game and then see if that kind of works for you. If it isn't, or if it's a little bit too narrow, then obviously you can dial it back a little bit to something that you are more comfortable with. But generally you want to run an as low a field of view setting as possible, or as accurate to what the field of view calculator is actually giving you. Obviously with triple screen setups you'll get a much wider field of views with those, and obviously basically what you want to do is minimize the amount of recalculation that your brain is having to do between what you would see in the real world and what you're actually seeing in game playing with. So yeah, that's all the camera stuff that I wanted to cover for this episode. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try and get back to you as soon as I possibly can. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you are enjoying the general content that has been going up on the channel, feel free to subscribe to the channel itself as well. And there's some stuff that I'm hoping to be bringing to the channel, as well as the Insider's Guide episode that I do on a weekly basis. So subscribe if you are kind of wanting that content. It's actually going to be actual race stuff with some commentary on the side as well. But other than that, thank you very much for watching, guys. Hopefully I shall see you soon. But in the meantime, have fun and take care.